From the depths of an immemorial past, whispers echo from an era where the line between survival and barbarism was as thin as life itself. 6.4 million years ago, at the dawn of humanity, a relentless cold descended upon the savannah, and with it, hunger, an invisible beast that gnawed at the souls of the first hominids. Under the shadow of a savage age, a starving ancestor made the choice that would forever mold human instincts. Are you ready to unravel the day hunger conquered humanity? The wind groaned through the tall grasses of the African savanna, carrying with it the damp smell of earth and the promise of an impending storm. The sky, a gray and oppressive mural, descended upon the vast landscape, transforming the horizon into an indistinct line of twilight. 6.4 million years ago, the world was a stage of sublime brutality, where every sunrise was a miracle and every dusk a test of survival. At the mouth of a dark cave, carved into the face of a rocky cliff that rose like a scar on the land, a group of Homo habilis huddled against the biting cold. The air inside the cave was thick with the acrid smell of freshly extinguished campfire smoke, mingled with the sweat and fear of the huddled bodies. The most prominent sound, however, was not the wind or the rustling of dry leaves, but the hungry rumble of empty stomachs, a mournful chorus that grew louder with each passing day without food. Among them, a female Homo habilis, Nyx, stood out. Her gaze, deep and perceptive, scanned the darkness of the cave, as if seeking answers where there were none. Nyx was young, but the relentless life of the savannah had already etched lines of weariness and worry onto her face. Her muscles, once agile and strong from the constant search for food, now trembled with weakness. Her skin, once bronzed by the sun, was pale and stretched over her protruding bones. She held a baby in her arms, a tiny, fragile being who, even in its restless sleep, seemed to feel the weight of the collective hunger. The child's sporadic cries were like a sharp knife in the heavy silence, reminding everyone of the vulnerability that surrounded them. Nyx's anguish was palpable. With every breath her child took, she felt despair deepen, the certainty that they needed food, and soon. With each muffled sob from the small body in her arms, a pang of panic pierced her chest, an icy fear that radiated through her entire being. The group's leader, Theron, an imposing male with scars from countless battles, tried to remain calm, but his eyes, red and bloodshot, betrayed the same apprehension. He was the most experienced hunter, the protector, but even Theron seemed to shrink under the weight of that incessant hunger. In recent days, hunting had been fruitless. Herds of wildebeest and zebras seemed to have vanished, swallowed by the vast and indifferent landscape. Edible fruits and roots were scarce, their tops dry and withered. The prolonged drought had swept away the vegetation, and with it, hope. The campfire, a symbol of warmth and security, was now just a pile of cold ashes. The aroma of smoke, which once brought comfort, was a cruel reminder of the emptiness in their bellies. Despair deepened with every growl of hunger that echoed in the stomachs of each group member, a constant reminder of the inevitability of their situation. One of the oldest members of the group, Kale, a wise man with tangled hair, eyes that carried the memory of many seasons, mumbled something in his guttural tongue, pointing to the sky outside. Cloud after cloud formed, dense and dark, but the rain did not come. Nature, which usually provided for them, now abandoned them. The sound of the wind howling through the cracks in the cave seemed like a funeral song, a premonition that something terrible was coming. Fear, an invisible predator, nestled in the hearts of each one, growing with every breath, every groan of hunger. Nyx clutched the baby to her chest, feeling the small body tremble. She knew that inaction was not an option. Hunger, a primitive and relentless force, was about to push them to a point of no return. What would they do when the last reserves of hope ran out? With every whimper from her child, every growl from her own stomach, Nyx felt a growing fury. a rage against the relentless nature that had abandoned them, and against the cruel fate that seemed to seal their end. The darkness of despair began to swallow the fragile flame of hope, and Nyx knew that soon this flame would be extinguished completely, leaving them at the mercy of the longest night of their lives. The next morning brought with it a dawn that seemed to mock their misery. The sun, a burning eye in the sky, burst forth from behind the gray clouds, painting the savanna in shades of amber and ochre. But the beauty of the landscape was a facade for the desolation that afflicted it. The smell of dry, cracked earth mingled with the metallic odor of exhaustion emanating from the bodies of the Homo habilis. The air, once fresh and invigorating, was dense with dust and the rising heat of a new day without promises. From the top of the cliff, where the cave was located, Nyx's gaze swept across the vast expanse of the savanna, a sea of yellowish grasses and twisted trees, with skeletal branches stretching like hungry fingers. The silence was broken only by the insistent buzzing of insects and the hot breath of the wind, which stirred up small clouds of dust. There were no signs of animal life, no fresh hunt tracks. The landscape seemed to have become a desert, a graveyard for their hopes, a vast and indifferent void that stretched as far as the eye could see, promising only more despair. Theron, his face contorted by hunger and frustration, led a small group out of the cave. His steps were heavy, each movement a visible effort. They dispersed, each one searching the parched earth for any sign of food, a root, an insect, anything that could soothe the pains in their bellies. Nyx watched from the cave entrance, the baby nestled in her lap. Her eyes, once full of hope, now reflected growing anguish. She saw Theron point to a small hole in the ground, a sign of perhaps a rodent, but digging revealed only dry, empty earth. With each failure, despair deepened, a slow poison corroding the last fiber of optimism. Discouragement spread like a disease, and the group, once resilient, began to buckle under the weight of deprivation. The echo of Theron's and his group's slow steps was a mournful sound, each footfall on the dry earth a reminder of the absence of life, the lack of food, the emptiness in their stomachs. In the afternoon, the heat became unbearable. Mirages danced on the horizon, deceiving the eye with non-existent lakes and leafy trees that were merely dry bushes. Nyx felt thirst burn in her throat, a constant pain that rivaled hunger. Her baby's cries grew weaker, an almost inaudible lament that broke her heart. She tried to breastfeed him, but her own breasts were dry, devoid of milk. The small body in her arms was limp, feverish. She rocked him gently, murmuring guttural words of comfort that she knew would bring no relief. A mother, as anguish at not being able to feed her child was a pain that surpassed all others. With each weak gasp from the baby, Nyx felt a pang of panic, a certainty that time was running out, and with it, the life of her tiny offspring. The sun, relentless, drained the little energy left in their bodies, turning hope into a mirage as unreal as the shimmering lakes on the horizon. The group returned at dusk, their faces dusty and their eyes vacant. They had found nothing, not a single animal to hunt, not a single fruit to gather. Reality struck them like a lightning bolt. They were trapped by the vastness of the savanna, by the relentless drought, by the absence of life. Hope faded with every passing minute. The air in the cave grew denser with the smell of despair. An oppressive silence fell over the group, broken only by groans of hunger and the faint cries of the youngest. Nyx watched Theron sit down, his head in his hands, the image of a defeated leader. She felt a chill run down her spine, a grim premonition. They had reached their limit. What would come next, when humanity was tested in its most primal essence? The darkness of night swallowed the last spark of optimism, leaving behind only the biting cold and the weight of hunger. A hunger that promised to devour not only their bodies, but their souls. The night dragged on, an eternity of torment and darkness. The cold of the savanna, which was once merely uncomfortable, was now a sharp knife cutting into their flesh, exacerbating the weakness of their starving bodies. Inside the cave, murmurs of hope had been replaced by groans of pain and whispers of despair. The smell of sickness and malnutrition hung heavy and nauseating in the air. Bodies huddled together, seeking each other's warmth, but vital heat seemed to be draining away with each breath. Nyx, with her child curled on her chest, felt her heart clench with each faint beat of the small body. The child's fever increased, and its breathing became more irregular, small gasps that tore at the silence. Every whisper of the wind at the cave entrance seemed to carry the lament of those who had already succumbed, a grim premonition of the approaching fate. Theron, Kale, and the other males took turns on watch, their eyes glazed over from hunger and lack of sleep. The faint crackle of a dry branch burning in the fire was the only sound to break the oppressive silence. A sound that once signified life now signified agony. The lack of food and water took its toll. One of the older members of the group, a man with a face etched with deep wrinkles and wise eyes, coughed faintly, his body trembling. His gaze fixed on Nyx and her child, a look of profound sadness and resignation. He knew that the end was near for some of them. The law of the jungle, cruel and inflexible, made no distinction of age or strength. The weakest would succumb first. The sweet and nauseating smell of death began to mingle with the air of the cave, a harbinger of what was to come. As dawn approached, the pale light peeking through the cave entrance revealed the extent of their misery. Faces were pale, cheeks sunken, eyes deep in dark sockets. Nyx's baby, once so vibrant in its fragility, was too quiet. She squeezed him, her heart beating a frantic rhythm in her chest. "No," she whispered, her voice hoarse and broken. She rocked him, tried to breastfeed him again, but the small body remained inert. The warmth, once so vital, now seemed to have drained away. The silence that followed was the most terrible Nyx had ever experienced. The silence of death. Her child. An icy spear pierced her heart, tearing it into 1,000 pieces. The pain that erupted in Nyx was a mute scream, a savage fury that threatened to tear her apart from within. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with dust and sweat. She couldn't believe it. Not her child. Not now. Her sobs echoed in the cave, a primal lament that woke the others. Theron approached, his face a mask of pain and helplessness. He knew there was nothing he could say or do to alleviate Nyx's suffering. Death was a constant presence in those hostile lands, but the loss of a child was a wound that never healed. The echo of Nyx's sobs mingled with the wind howling in the cave, a chorus of pain and despair that seemed to engulf them all. Kale sat beside Nyx, his gaze filled with compassion and sorrow. He lightly touched her shoulder, a gesture of solidarity amidst the desolation. The smell of death filled the air, not just the death of the baby, but the threat of death that hung over all of them. Hunger, once an inconvenience, was now a lethal enemy, taking lives mercilessly. Nyx hugged the inert body of her child, her mind in a whirlwind of pain and rage. She looked at the other group members, their faces drawn, their eyes reflecting the same shadow of hopelessness. That day, something broke inside Nyx. Something primal, an instinct for survival that would go beyond anything they knew. Hunger had won a battle, but the war was far from over. What would be the cost of this victory? The darkness of despair deepened, and Nyx felt the weight of a grim secret that would soon be revealed. A secret that would change the fate of her tribe forever. Nyx's baby's body was wrapped in dry leaves and placed in a small rock crevice, an improvised grave amidst the indifferent vastness of the savannah. The ritual was brief, painful, and silent. The smell of damp earth mingled with the bitter odor of morning. The scorching sun, which had ascended into the sky, seemed to mock their sadness, warming the landscape without bringing comfort to their hearts. Nyx watched with dry eyes. Pain had turned into a cold stone in her chest, an unbearable weight. The cave, once a refuge, now felt like a suffocating prison, filled with memories and laments. The silence of that makeshift burial was a mute scream of despair, an echo of the life that had vanished and the hope that was fading. As the day progressed, hunger became agony. Bodies shriveled, strength drained away. Murmurs turned into moans and moans into whispers. The weakness was so intense that even moving a muscle was an effort. Theron, his voice hoarse and his eyes sunken, tried to plan a new hunting expedition. The words barely left his throat. The others looked at him with empty eyes, devoid of energy for any attempt. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the wind whistling at the cave entrance. The smell of sweat, earth, and despair intensified, suffocating them. Each breath was an effort. Every muscle trembled, and the awareness of imminent death hung over them like a hungry vulture. It was then that Nyx stood up. Her movement, slow and trembling, attracted everyone's attention. She walked to the center of the cave. Her eyes, once filled with pain, now burned with a cold and terrifying resolve. She looked at the body of the elder who had succumbed during the night, his frail and inert body wrapped in a shroud of leaves. The silence in the cave was absolute. The air was so thick that it seemed as if time had stopped. The smell of the elder's lifeless body, a mixture of earth and the sweet fragrance of death, permeated the environment. Nyx's mind was a whirlwind, but a single idea crystallized. A terrible but undeniable idea. "We can't wait any longer." Nyx's voice was a hoarse whisper, but it reverberated through the cave like thunder. "There's nothing out there. No game, no fruit, nothing." Her eyes fixed on Theron, on Kale, on every member of the group. "We will die, one by one." Fear settled in the eyes of some, but in others, there was a glimmer of understanding. She then looked at the elder's body. The thought, at first, was a mere glimpse, a fleeting nightmare. But hunger, that invisible predator, had distorted reality, transforming the unthinkable into an option, the only option. The darkness of despair had ignited a grim flame in her heart, a flame that burned with the urgency of survival. Kale flinched, his eyes wide with horror. Theron, on the other hand, looked at the elder's body and then at Nyx, his face a complex mixture of shock and grim comprehension. The taboo, the invisible line that separated humanity from the deepest savagery. But hunger was a cruel master, and its lessons were brutal. Nyx stepped forward, her hand extended towards the inert body. She had no more tears. Pain had been replaced by a chilling determination, an instinct for survival that surpassed any moral or taboo. The line between life and death, between humanity and beast, had dissolved in the ardent flame of hunger. What would they do now? Would they follow Nyx or succumb to certain death? The choice was clear, but the price unimaginable. Everyone's breath was held, awaiting Nyx's next action, an action that would seal the fate of their tribe forever. The smell of fear and hesitation was almost palpable, mingling with the smell of death in the cave. The air felt heavier, denser, as if time itself struggled to resist what was about to happen. The faint crackle of the fire, rekindled with a few dry branches, seemed like a profane sound in that environment. The eyes of the Homo habilis were fixed on Nyx, their bodies trembling, their minds in a whirlwind of horror and hopelessness. Primal fear, the fear of the unknown and the forbidden, battled against the overwhelming urgency of hunger. The loudest sound was the accelerated beat of their own hearts, a constant drum pounding in their ears. Every dancing shadow on the cave wall seemed to take on grotesque forms, reflecting the terror that seized their souls. Nyx, with the flint knife in her hand, a tool once used to hunt animals, now seemed to have a grim purpose. She knelt beside the elder's body, her face a mask of chilling determination. The silence was absolute, a silence that screamed the weight of the decision about to be made. Theron, the leader, stood still, his expression unreadable. He neither objected nor gave an order. His eyes wandered between Nix and the group, an internal struggle unfolding in his gaze. He knew that the group's survival depended on that action, however hideous it seemed. The dilemma they faced was brutal. The hunger that devoured their bodies or the breaking of a taboo that would tear their souls apart. The flint blade gleamed in the flickering firelight. The smell of blood, subtle at first, began to permeate the air, a smell that caused a wave of nausea in some, but in others, a spark of twisted hope. The sound was almost inaudible, a wet thudding noise that churned stomachs and made minds recoil in horror. Nix, with every movement, was breaking an ancient taboo, a barrier that humanity would take ages to rebuild. The tears she had not shed for the death of her child now seemed to flow into her heart, freezing it. The weight of that decision was overwhelming, but the urgency of survival spoke louder than any morality. Kale, in a corner, turned his face away, unable to witness the scene. Some of the younger ones whimpered, clutching each other, but others, the hungriest, the most desperate, watched with morbid curiosity, their glazed eyes fixed on what Nix was doing. Hunger was a fire that consumed everything, even morality. Nix's act was not one of cruelty, but of despair, of survival. She felt no joy, only a grim determination, a pressing need to ensure the group's survival, whatever the cost. The air was thick with tension, with revulsion, and with the primal necessity that propelled that act. When Nix stood up, the knife in her hand was stained. The smell was now stronger, more metallic, more real. She looked at the group, her eyes dull, but with unquestionable authority. No one spoke. No one moved. The silence was the testimony of a fall, of a point of no return. The flesh, the promise of energy, of life. Hunger, the invisible beast, had finally won. What would happen now that they had crossed the line? Humanity, at its dawn, had bowed to the most primitive of needs, and the price of that breach they could not yet imagine. The fate of that tribe, and perhaps of humanity itself, was sealed in that grim moment, a legacy of survival forged in darkness. The next dawn emerged, not as a harbinger of hope, but as a silent witness to a grim transition. The air in the cave, though cleansed by the morning winds, still carried the subtle remnants of an odor that would never be forgotten, a reminder of the act that had saved them, yet also marked them forever. The smell of the fire, now stronger, warmed their bodies, but not their souls. The faces of the Homo habilis were different. There was an emptiness in the eyes of some, a shadow of shame. But in others, there was an icy resilience, a pragmatic acceptance of what had been done to ensure survival. The sun, which had once seemed to mock their misery, now cast a cold light upon the scene, illuminating the brutal truth of their existence. Nix sat a little apart, observing the group. She hadn't touched the flesh. She couldn't. The image of what she had done was seared into her mind, an indelible scar. But she saw Theron, and then Kale, each of them, with initial reluctance, partaking in the macabre feast. The sound of chewing was low, almost ashamed, broken only by the crackle of the fire. No one spoke. Necessity had overcome aversion. The instinct for survival had subjugated revulsion. The smell of cooked meat, though grotesque in its origin, was, for their starving bodies, a promise of life. Hunger had won, but victory came with a price, an invisible weight that would settle upon the shoulders of each of them. The days that followed were a silent battle between need and conscience. Hunger had been sated, but the memory of what had been done lingered. The group moved on, seeking new lands, new resources, but the experience had changed something in them. The line between life and death had become thinner, and the capacity to resort to extreme acts for survival had been revealed. The smell of the earth, of the leaves, of the wild, now mingled with the remembrance of that disturbing odor. Every step forward was a reminder of the past, a footprint left in the mud of their own morality. Nix, over time, became an enigmatic figure. She was respected for her courage and her decision, but there was a distance in her gaze, a weight she would carry forever. She became the guardian of a dark secret, the personification of the thin line separating Homo habilis from complete savagery. The act, once unthinkable, had become an option, a tool for survival in a merciless world. Her eyes, once filled with anguish, now carried the depth of a grim wisdom, the wisdom of one who had looked into the abyss and survived. As time passed, the savanna revealed new resources. Rains came, bringing with them life. Herds returned, and fruits reappeared on the trees. The threat of hunger diminished, but the lesson learned that day, the day hunger conquered humanity, remained. The taboo of cannibalism did not disappear, but the memory of its breach remained as a grim reminder of the fragility of morality in the face of extreme necessity. Nature had rebalanced itself, but the soul of that group had been altered forever. The Homo habilis continued their journey, evolving, adapting, but that day left an indelible mark on the human psyche. A shadow, a whisper of a primitive instinct that even dormant would always exist. The legacy of that hunger, that choice, would manifest in future challenges, in new eras of scarcity and despair, when humanity would again be forced to confront the darkness within itself. The story of the first human to devour another was not merely a tragedy of hunger, but a landmark, a premonition of what humans were capable of doing to survive. The path of evolution was set, and at its roots, there was the shadow of an unthinkable act, a forgotten secret that continues to echo in the human soul to this day. How far would humanity be willing to go in the name of survival? The answer, perhaps, is still being written.